Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Rachel sat across from me at our favorite cafe, the same place we had spent countless mornings sipping coffee, sharing quiet conversations, and making plans for a future I thought we were building together. But today, something was different, something was off, something felt so heavy in the air that I could practically feel it pressing against my skin, making it harder to breathe. She wasn't smiling like she usually did, wasn't reaching for my hand absent-mindedly, wasn't glancing up at me with that easy, familiar warmth that had always made me feel like I belonged in her world, like I was enough. Instead, she was too composed, too careful, her fingers curled around the ceramic mug in front of her eyes flickering between mine and the tabletop, as if she were rehearsing whatever she was about to say, as if she were trying to soften a blow she had already decided to deliver. I could feel the moments stretching, dragging, suffocating us both. And yet she still hadn't said a word, still hadn't torn the Band-Aid off, still hadn't put whatever this was into words. Finally, I exhaled, forcing out a chuckle that didn't quite land, shaking my head slightly as I leaned back in my chair, trying to lighten the mood, trying to convince myself that this wasn't what it felt like. "All right, Ratch," I said, watching as she flinched ever so slightly at the casual way I said her name, at the familiarity of it, at the history it carried. "You're acting like you just ran over my dog. What's going on?" She let out a breath, slow and steady, setting her mug down carefully, deliberately, as if she needed to make sure it didn't shatter between her fingers. "Ethan," she started, her voice soft, too soft, like she was already asking for forgiveness. "I've been thinking a lot about us lately, and—" She hesitated, biting her lip, searching my face for something, maybe some kind of understanding that wasn't there yet, before she continued. "I think we need to break up." For a second, the words didn't register, didn't make sense, didn't compute in the way they were supposed to, like she had just spoken a language I didn't understand, like she had just dropped a bomb in the middle of our conversation and was now waiting for me to pick up the pieces. I blinked at her, feeling my body go strangely numb, my hands tightening around the edge of the table, my pulse thrumming just a little too fast in my ears. "What?" I finally managed, my voice coming out flatter than I intended, completely devoid of the shock, the confusion, the gut-wrenching disbelief that was ripping through me. Rachel exhaled again, this time looking away, this time unable to meet my eyes, this time choosing to stare at anything but me. "It's not that I don't care about you, Ethan," she said, and somehow those words made everything worse, made my chest tighten, made my stomach sink, made me feel like I was about to hear something that would change everything. But she trailed off, swallowing hard, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, hesitating just long enough for me to catch the guilt flickering across her face. "But what?" I pressed, my voice sharper than before, more forceful, more desperate, more demanding. Rachel sighed, closing her eyes for a brief second before finally looking at me. And this time, there was something different in her expression, something almost pitying, something that made me want to laugh and scream all at once. "It's just my coworkers think we're not a good match," she admitted finally, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant, as if she knew exactly how it would sound, but was still saying it anyway. "They say you're not really in my league." The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at her, waiting for her to take it back, to laugh, to tell me this was some kind of joke, but she didn't even flinch, didn't even seem to realize that she had just ripped the ground out from under me, that she had just turned our entire relationship into something cheap, something superficial, something dictated by the opinions of people who had never been part of it in the first place. I let out a slow, disbelieving breath, shaking my head, trying to process the weight of what she had just said, trying to understand how someone I had loved, trusted, built something with could reduce us to a conversation over happy hour drinks with her coworkers, how she could let strangers decide that I wasn't worthy of standing beside her. I swallowed back the bitterness rising in my throat, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself, to keep myself from saying something I wouldn't be able to take back. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice calmer than I felt, my heart pounding so violently that I thought it might shatter my ribs. "We've been together for over 2 years, and now, suddenly, you decide I'm not in your league because a bunch of rich marketing snobs told you so?" Rachel winced slightly at my words, but she didn't deny it, didn't even try to pretend like it wasn't exactly what had happened, didn't try to make it sound better than it was. "It's not just that," she tried, but I could tell from the way she hesitated, from the way she refused to meet my gaze, that she didn't really believe her own words. "It's just, I see my future, Ethan, and I want to be with someone who—" She cut herself off, shaking her head like she couldn't bring herself to say the rest. But I already knew exactly what she meant. Someone better. Someone more successful. Someone who wouldn't make her look ordinary. I exhaled through my nose, forcing myself to nod, forcing myself to accept the reality of this moment. Even though everything in me was screaming to fight, to yell, to ask her why I suddenly wasn't enough when I had been enough yesterday, last week, last year. But I didn't. Instead, I pushed back my chair, standing up, my body moving before my mind had fully caught up, before my heart could beg me to stay, to argue, to make her see me again. Rachel looked up at me, something almost uncertain, almost regretful flickering across her face, as if she had expected me to fight, as if she had wanted me to give her a reason to change her mind. But I didn't give her that. I just looked at her, at the woman I thought I knew, at the person I'd given my heart to, at the stranger sitting in front of me, and I shook my head. "You know what, Rachel?" I said, my voice steady, even despite the way my entire world had just collapsed in on itself. "I hope they were worth it." Then, without another word, I turned and walked away, not looking back, not letting myself see whatever expression was left on her face, not allowing myself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she already regretted it. But something in my gut told me, this wasn't over yet. I don't remember driving home. I don't remember unlocking my door. I don't remember throwing my keys onto the kitchen counter, or kicking off my shoes, or collapsing onto the couch like all the air had been punched out of me. All I remember is the silence, the kind that sits heavy in your chest, the kind that makes everything feel too real, too raw, too unbearable. The breakup had happened less than 2 hours ago, and yet the words kept replaying in my mind, looping over and over, each time hitting harder than the last. "You're not in my league." It didn't matter that she hadn't said it in those exact words. It didn't matter that she had tried to soften it, had hesitated before saying it outright, had avoided my eyes like she knew exactly how brutal it sounded. Because at the end of the day, that was exactly what she meant. I wasn't good enough for her, and she had finally decided to let me know. I exhaled sharply, leaning forward, rubbing my hands over my face, as if I could scrub the memory out of my mind, as if I could erase the last few hours and pretend like none of it had ever happened. My phone sat next to me on the coffee table, screen dark, completely silent, no messages, no missed calls, no sign that Rachel had even thought twice about what she had just done. And for some stupid reason, that hurt more than anything, I reached for the bottle of whiskey sitting on the shelf, one I had barely touched since I'd bought it months ago, unscrewing the cap with a sharp twist and taking a long sip straight from the bottle. It burned on the way down, but I barely noticed, barely cared, barely felt anything other than the dull, pulsing ache in my chest that refused to go away. And then, against my better judgment, I picked up my phone. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe some part of me thought there would be a message waiting, some last-minute change of heart, some admission that she had made a mistake, that she didn't mean it, that she wanted me back, that she regretted letting me go so easily. But there was nothing. So instead, I did something even dumber. I opened my camera roll. A mistake. A massive, gut-wrenching, soul-crushing mistake. Because there she was, Rachel, smiling at me, laughing, reaching for my hand in some long-forgotten moment of happiness that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. A photo from our trip to the mountains last year. Her cheeks flushed from the cold, her hair a mess from the wind, her arms wrapped around my waist as if she never wanted to let go. Another from the beach, where she was standing in the water, looking at me over her shoulder, that soft, knowing smile playing on her lips like she had just told an inside joke meant only for the two of us. Then a video, one where she was singing off-key in the car, her head thrown back in laughter, completely unguarded, completely mine. I should have stopped looking, should have locked my phone and shoved it across the room, but I couldn't. Instead, I scrolled further, diving deeper, forcing myself to relive every single moment that I had convinced myself had meant something, every single moment where I thought we were real, where I thought we had a future, where I thought she loved me the way I loved her. I took another sip of whiskey, the warmth doing nothing to drown out the bitterness pooling in my stomach. My phone buzzed suddenly, making me jolt, my heart leaping into my throat, my brain immediately, foolishly hoping it was her. But it wasn't. It was Jake. Jake Barr. Now. I stared at the message for a second, considering just ignoring it, considering staying here, drowning myself in alcohol and bad decisions and memories that no longer belonged to me. But then, I exhaled, grabbed my jacket, and left. The bar was dimly lit, buzzing with conversation, the kind of place where no one paid attention to anything but their own problems, which was exactly what I needed. Jake was already sitting at the counter, 2 beers in front of him, his expression unreadable as he watched me slide onto the stool beside him. He didn't say anything at first, just nudged one of the beers toward me, waiting until I had taken a long sip before finally speaking. "So," he said, voice casual, but I could hear the tension underneath. "You gonna tell me why you look like someone just ran over your dog?" I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head, setting my beer down with a little more force than necessary. "Rachel dumped me," I said flatly, watching as his brows shot up in surprise. Jake blinked at me, then let out a low whistle, leaning back slightly. "Damn," he muttered, shaking his head. "Did not see that one coming." He took a sip of his drink, studying me carefully. "So what was her excuse?" I sighed, rubbing my hand over my jaw, debating whether or not to tell him the truth, debating whether saying it out loud would make it hurt more or less. "Apparently," I finally said, voice laced with bitterness, "her coworkers think I'm not in her league." Jake stared at me for a long second, then barked out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "You're kidding?" "Wish I was," I muttered, finishing the rest of my beer in one long gulp. Jake shook his head, exhaling loudly, tapping his fingers against the bar. "Man, that's some next-level bullshit," he said, his voice sharper now, edged with something close to anger. "She let a bunch of stuck-up corporate assholes decide that you weren't good enough for her?" He scoffed, shaking his head again. "I hope she enjoys her perfect, empty little life because she's going to regret this." Just wait. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that Rachel was sitting somewhere, feeling even an ounce of the pain that was slowly tearing me apart from the inside out. But right now, as I sat in that bar, nursing my second beer, feeling like my entire world had just flipped upside down, I wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, somewhere across the city, Rachel was surrounded by her coworkers, sitting at a sleek, high-end restaurant, listening as they cheered her on, telling her that she had done the right thing, that she had dodged a bullet, that she was better off now. She laughed, smiled, nodded along, let them pour her another drink, let them tell her that she was moving on to bigger and better things. But then, as the conversation drifted, as the laughter faded, as she reached for her phone, something unexpected happened. Her fingers hesitated over my name. She wasn't supposed to miss me, but for some reason, she already did. Rachel had expected to feel a sense of relief, a kind of weightlessness that came with making the right decision, a certainty that she had done what was best for herself, for her future, for the person she was meant to become. That's what her coworkers had told her, what they had insisted when she showed up to dinner that night. Freshly single, freshly unburdened, freshly free. They had raised their glasses to her, toasted to her new beginning, to her fresh start, to her ability to finally find someone on her level. And for the first hour, maybe even the first two, she had almost believed them. But then, somewhere between her second and third glass of wine, somewhere between the laughter and the compliments and the endless, mindless conversation, she had pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over Ethan's name, her chest tightening with something she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't regret, not yet, not fully, not in a way she was ready to admit, but it was something close, something strange and unfamiliar, something that made her hesitate for just a second too long before locking her phone and shoving it back into her purse. The next morning, she told herself that it was just an adjustment period, that of course things felt a little weird, that it wasn't about Ethan himself, but about the sudden shift in her routine, the empty space where his presence used to be. And yet, as the days passed, as she moved through her life without him, she started to notice things she hadn't expected, things she hadn't prepared for, things she hadn't even considered when she had made her decision to leave. She had assumed that her life would get better, that the people around her would see her in a new light, that being single would somehow elevate her status, that she would finally be seen as the person she had been trying to become all along. But instead, the world felt different in a way that she didn't like, in a way that unsettled her, in a way that made her question whether she had miscalculated something essential. At work, people treated her the same, but only on the surface. The men who had once been friendly and professional were suddenly flirtatious in a way that made her skin crawl. Their smiles just a little too knowing, their compliments just a little too rehearsed, their attention just a little too calculated. Her boss, who had once treated her with a sort of distant respect, now made passing comments about her social life, about how she was finally embracing her potential, about how she had outgrown certain things. At first, she convinced herself that it was all in her head, that nothing had actually changed, that she was simply being overly sensitive because of the transition. But then came the moment that broke through the illusion, the moment that made something deep inside her twist in a way that she couldn't ignore. It was during a company happy hour, a casual outing meant to encourage networking, a gathering of coworkers and potential business connections, a place where reputations were built and maintained. Rachel had dressed well, had shown up with her usual confidence, had expected the night to be an affirmation of her new life, a celebration of her decision to move forward. And then there was Nathan Parker. Nathan was one of the senior executives, a man with money, power, and the kind of arrogance that made people laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny. He was respected, admired, a man who could make or break careers with a single decision, a man who, until now, had barely acknowledged Rachel's existence beyond polite professionalism. But tonight, for the first time, he noticed her, and she hated it. He leaned in too close, his hand resting on the back of her chair, his cologne too strong, his voice too smooth, his compliments too polished. He talked about how she was finally stepping into the life she was meant for, how she was too good to settle for something average, how he always knew she had more potential than she let on. And for the first time since she had ended things with Ethan, she wanted to throw up, because suddenly it all made sense. Why her coworkers had pushed her to break up with him, why they had insisted that she could do better, why they had never truly approved of a relationship. It had never been about Ethan himself. It had never been about her deserving better. It had been about control, about ensuring that she was available, moldable, within reach. And just like that, she felt it. The first real flicker of regret, the first real moment where she wondered if she had made a mistake. She excused herself quickly, muttering something about needing fresh air, stepping outside into the cool night, inhaling deeply as if she could breathe out the suffocating weight of realization that had just settled into her chest. And without thinking, without planning, without even understanding why, she pulled out her phone, opened Instagram, and searched for Ethan's name. She expected to find nothing, expected him to be just as stuck as she was, expected him to be nursing his wounds, expected him to be waiting for her to change her mind. But what she found instead made her stomach drop. Because there he was, sitting at a bar with a woman she didn't recognize, a woman who was laughing, a woman who had her hand resting lightly on his forearm, as if she belonged there. And for the first time, Rachel felt something she never thought she would feel. Jealousy. Not because Ethan had moved on too quickly, not because he was happy without her, but because he wasn't supposed to be the one who was thriving. She was supposed to be the one with the better life. She was supposed to be the one who had moved up. She was supposed to be the one who had left him behind. But instead, she was standing on a cold sidewalk, staring at her phone, wondering if she had just thrown away the best thing she ever had. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan was sitting at that bar, laughing for the first time in days, finally realizing that maybe, just maybe, losing Rachel wasn't the tragedy he had thought it was. And Rachel? Rachel was just beginning to understand what it felt like to be the one who wasn't enough. Rachel had always believed that she was the kind of woman who knew what she wanted, the kind of woman who didn't second-guess her decisions, the kind of woman who could walk away from something and never look back. That was what she had told herself the night she ended things with Ethan. What she had convinced herself when her coworkers reassured her that she had made the right choice. What she had clung to in the days that followed whenever she felt that strange, nagging pull in her chest, that uncomfortable sense that something wasn't sitting right. But now, as she sat alone in her apartment, the glow of the city outside her window casting long shadows across the floor, she couldn't ignore the fact that her new life, the one she had so desperately convinced herself was waiting for her on the other side of Ethan, wasn't as glamorous as she had imagined. She had expected excitement, had expected adventure, had expected to feel free, unburdened, unshackled from the weight of a relationship that had apparently been holding her back. But instead, what she felt was something heavier, colder, more unsettling than she had prepared for. She had spent the past week going through the motions, pretending that everything was exactly as it should be, forcing smiles at work, making plans with her friends, ignoring the moments when she instinctively reached for her phone to text Ethan before remembering that she wasn't supposed to do that anymore. At first, she told herself that it was just habit, just muscle memory, just a temporary side effect of the transition. But now, as she sat there, wine glass in hand, staring at her phone like it held all the answers she didn't want to admit she needed, she knew that it wasn't just habit. It was regret. It had started small, subtle, easy to push away. An empty space in her mornings where his good morning texts used to be, a strange hollowness in her evenings when she realized she had no one to talk to about her day, a creeping sense of unease whenever she was in a crowded room and still felt completely alone. But then, as the days passed, as the silence grew louder, as the excitement of being single faded into something that felt a lot more like loneliness, she found herself thinking about Ethan more than she wanted to admit. And now, with a bottle of wine half empty beside her, with the city humming quietly outside her window, with nothing but the sound of her own thoughts pressing against her skull, she did something she swore she wouldn't do. She grabbed her phone and texted him. "Rachel, hey, you up?" She stared at the message for a long moment, her heart pounding faster than it should have, her fingers gripping the phone just a little too tightly as she waited, as she told herself that this wasn't a mistake, as she convinced herself that he would respond, that he had been waiting for her to reach out, that he would see her name on his screen and realize that he had missed her just as much as she had missed him. But the seconds passed, then a minute, then 5, then 10, and still nothing. No response, no typing bubble, no sign that he had even read the message. Rachel exhaled slowly, setting her phone down, staring at the screen like she could will it into giving her what she wanted, like she could somehow undo the mistake she had made by letting him go so easily, so thoughtlessly, so stupidly. And then, as if the universe had decided to punish her for every selfish decision she had made, her phone buzzed. Not with a message from Ethan, but with a notification from social media. She picked it up without thinking, unlocking it quickly, her wine-fueled mind moving too fast for her own good, until she saw what was on the screen, until she saw the post that made her entire body go still. Ethan, at a bar, with another woman. The photo wasn't staged, wasn't calculated, wasn't something designed to make her jealous, but that was exactly what it did. Because there he was, sitting at a booth, a drink in his hand, smiling in a way that she hadn't seen in a long time. And the woman beside him, some brunette she didn't recognize, some stranger who had no business being that close to him, some woman who was laughing at something he had said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Was the final nail in the coffin. Rachel felt her stomach drop, a slow, twisting, unbearable sensation creeping up her spine, something that felt too much like jealousy, too much like anger, too much like the realization that she had made the worst mistake of her life. Because Ethan wasn't supposed to move on this quickly. He was supposed to be broken, devastated, waiting for her to change her mind. He was supposed to miss her. But instead, he looked like he was doing just fine without her. She took a shaky breath, trying to convince herself that it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything, that the woman was probably just a friend, that Ethan wasn't actually moving on, that he wasn't actually happy without her. But no matter how many excuses she tried to come up with, no matter how many ways she tried to spin it in her mind, she couldn't escape the truth staring her in the face. She had spent the past week telling herself that she had made the right decision. But now, for the first time, she knew that she had lost something she wasn't going to get back. And the worst part? She wasn't just losing Ethan. She was about to lose everything. Rachel had always believed that success was about control, about carefully curating every detail of her life, about making the right choices, about moving forward without looking back, without second-guessing, without hesitation. She had spent years building the perfect version of herself, molding herself into someone who was admired, respected, envied, someone who had it all. The career, the connections, the confidence that made people believe she was untouchable. And for a while, that illusion had been enough. That carefully constructed version of her life had been all she needed to feel like she was winning, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But now, for the first time, she felt completely, undeniably out of control. It started small, just like the regret had, creeping in at the edges, subtle at first, something she could brush off, something she could ignore if she just focused hard enough, if she just convinced herself that things were fine. But things weren't fine. Not at work, not in her personal life, not in the spaces where she had once felt the most secure. Her confidence was slipping, her patience was thinning, her once perfect world was starting to show cracks that she couldn't repair no matter how hard she tried. At work, she was making mistakes, small ones at first, missed deadlines, forgotten emails, moments where she caught herself zoning out in meetings, struggling to focus, struggling to care. But then the mistakes started getting bigger, harder to ignore, harder to explain away. She missed an important call with a major client, forgot to send in a report that should have been finalized days ago, made a minor miscalculation in a campaign budget that resulted in an embarrassing correction that had to be explained to her boss. People were noticing. The same coworkers who had once praised her, who had encouraged her to walk away from Ethan, who had told her that she deserved better, were now looking at her with something that felt dangerously close to doubt. "Rachel, is everything all right?" Her boss had asked her one afternoon, his voice careful, measured, like he was already preparing for an excuse. She had forced a smile, had straightened her posture, had pretended that everything was fine, that she was fine, that she wasn't unraveling at the seams. "Of course," she had said, with that same effortless confidence that had always worked before, that had always convinced people that she was the most capable person in the room. "Just a lot on my plate right now." He had nodded. But there had been something in his expression, something skeptical, something that told her he didn't quite believe her, something that told her that her carefully built reputation was no longer as unshakable as it had once been. And outside of work, things were even worse. She had tried to do what she was supposed to do, had tried to move forward, had tried to embrace the single life that was supposed to be filled with excitement and new experiences and men who were better suited for her than Ethan had ever been. She had agreed to a date with a guy from her office, someone successful, someone polished, someone who fit the image of the life she had convinced herself she wanted. But the moment she sat across from him at the expensive restaurant, listening to him talk about his investments, his vacations, his luxury car, she felt absolutely nothing. He was attractive. He was confident. He was successful in every way that mattered. And yet, all she could think about was how bored she was, how forced this conversation felt, how completely and utterly hollow the entire experience was. She had smiled, had nodded, had laughed at all the right moments, had done everything she was supposed to do, but deep down she knew. This man didn't know her. And worse, she didn't want him to, because the entire time he was talking, the entire time she was pretending to be interested, all she could think about was Ethan, his easygoing laughter, the way he used to look at her like she was the only person in the room, the way he could make her feel at home just by being there. She excused herself to the restroom halfway through the date, gripping the edge of the sink, staring at her reflection, hating the person staring back at her. And before she even realized what she was doing, before she could stop herself, she pulled out her phone, opened her old text thread, and typed out a message. "Rachel, I miss you." She stared at the words for a long time, her heart pounding, her breath uneven, her hands shaking slightly as she hovered over the send button, telling herself that this wasn't desperation, that this wasn't weakness, that this was just a moment of honesty. And then finally she hit send, and waited, and waited, and waited. But Ethan didn't respond. Minutes passed, then hours, and still nothing. She checked his social media, hoping for some sign that he had seen the message, that he was thinking about her, that he was waiting for the right moment to respond. But instead, she saw something that made her stomach drop. A new post. Ethan, smiling, sitting on a rooftop patio, drink in hand, surrounded by people, looking genuinely happy in a way that she hadn't seen in a long time. And right there, next to him, laughing, leaning in slightly, was the same woman from the bar. Rachel's fingers tightened around her phone, her entire body going rigid, a slow, sickening realization settling into her chest. Ethan had moved on. And worse, he wasn't even looking back. The sinking feeling in her stomach deepened, twisting into something ugly, something unbearable, something that made her feel like she was the one who had been left behind. She had convinced herself that breaking up with him had been her decision, her choice, her power move. But now, as she stared at that photo, as she scrolled through the comments, as she saw how many people were reacting, how many people were liking, supporting, encouraging his happiness without her, she realized the truth. She had thought she was in control of this breakup. But now it was controlling her. Rachel had always been good at keeping her emotions in check, at presenting herself as poised, as confident, as completely in control of any situation she found herself in. But now, as she stood outside Ethan's apartment door, her hands trembling slightly, her breath uneven, her stomach twisted into knots, she realized that for the first time in a long time, she had no idea what she was walking into. She had spent the past few weeks pretending that she was fine, convincing herself that she had made the right choice, ignoring the gnawing feeling in her gut that told her she had made a mistake, that she had thrown something real away for reasons that didn't even feel valid anymore. And now she was standing here, heart pounding, hands clenched at her sides, staring at the door of a man who might not even want to see her anymore, a man who had every reason to shut her out, a man who had started to move on while she was only now realizing how lost she felt without him. She hadn't planned this, hadn't rehearsed what she was going to say, hadn't even thought it through beyond the overwhelming, all-consuming need to see him, to look him in the eye, to tell him that she was sorry, that she had been wrong, that she had let other people's opinions dictate something that had never belonged to them in the first place. Before she could change her mind, before she could talk herself out of it, she raised her hand and knocked. The sound echoed in the hallway, and for a moment, she thought that maybe he wasn't home, that maybe she had missed her chance, that maybe this was her punishment for walking away so easily. But then, she heard footsteps, the unmistakable sound of movement from the other side, the quiet creak of the door unlocking. And then, just like that, there he was. Ethan stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp and guarded, his posture relaxed but not inviting, not welcoming, not the way it used to be when he saw her. He didn't look surprised to see her, but he also didn't look particularly happy about it. And for some reason, that hurt more than she expected it to. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken words, with memories, with everything that had been left unresolved. Finally, Rachel swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze, forcing herself to find her voice, even though it felt like it might crack under the weight of what she was about to say. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended, almost hesitant, almost vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to feeling. Ethan studied her for a second longer, his jaw tightening slightly, his fingers flexing at his sides before he finally stepped back, allowing her inside without a word. The apartment was the same as she remembered, but at the same time, it wasn't. It felt different now, felt less like the place they had shared and more like a place that no longer belonged to her, like a space where her presence no longer fit. She took a deep breath, turning to face him, realizing just how much harder this was going to be than she had expected. "Ethan," she started, her fingers curling into the sleeves of her coat, her pulse hammering against her ribs. "I messed up." He didn't say anything, didn't react, didn't offer any kind of comforting reassurance that this was fixable, and somehow, that made her even more nervous. "I listened to the wrong people," she admitted, the words tumbling out of her faster now, as if saying them quickly would make them hurt less, as if getting them out would somehow undo the damage she had already done. "I let them get into my head, let them make me believe that what we had wasn't enough, that I should want something else, something more, but the truth is," she exhaled sharply, shaking her head, her throat tight, her vision blurring slightly. "The truth is, I was happy with you, Ethan. I just didn't realize it until it was too late." Still, he said nothing. Rachel bit her lip, her hands gripping the fabric of her coat even tighter, feeling like she was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could either save her or completely break her. "I thought that if I ended things first, if I walked away, I'd be the one in control," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper now. "But I wasn't in control at all. I was just scared." Ethan finally moved then, finally shifted slightly, finally let something flicker across his expression, something that wasn't anger, wasn't indifference, wasn't the cold distance he had been keeping between them. It was brief, gone before she could fully process what it meant, but it was enough to make her feel the smallest spark of hope. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said quickly, sensing that he was on the verge of saying something, knowing that whatever he was about to say would be the deciding factor between whether or not she had a chance to fix this. "But I just needed you to know that I regret it, that I regret every single second I spent away from you, that I regret listening to people who don't even know me the way you do." Ethan let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair, his silence stretching on just long enough to make her feel like she was about to collapse under the weight of it. And then finally he spoke. "You really think it's that simple?" His voice was quiet but firm, his eyes searching hers, his posture still tense, still wary, still unwilling to let her back in so easily. "That you can just show up, say you regret it, and everything will go back to the way it was?" Rachel swallowed hard, shaking her head quickly, her pulse hammering against her ribs. "No," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve another chance." But she took a shaky breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze, forcing herself to say the words that felt like they were burning in her throat. "But I love you, Ethan, and I should have fought for us instead of walking away." Ethan stared at her for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching hers for something she couldn't define, something that felt like he was trying to decide whether she was worth the risk of trusting again. And then, just when she thought he was about to respond, just when she thought she might finally get an answer, he did something she hadn't expected. He stepped back, not angrily, not dramatically, not in a way that screamed finality, but in a way that told her that he wasn't ready to let her back in. Rachel felt her stomach sink, her hands clenching at her sides, her breath catching in her throat. "Ethan," he exhaled, shaking his head slightly, his expression still unreadable, his choice still unclear. "I don't know if I can trust you again," he admitted, his voice softer now, but still firm, still certain, still guarded. And in that moment, Rachel realized that she wasn't just fighting for Ethan's forgiveness. She was fighting for the chance to prove she was worth it. Rachel had always been confident in her ability to talk her way out of a bad situation, had always known how to smooth things over, how to find the right words, how to manipulate a moment until it worked in her favor. But now, standing in front of Ethan, watching the way his expression remained unreadable, watching the way his body stayed tense, guarded, unwilling to give her anything, she realized that this was different, that this wasn't something she could just fix with an apology and a promise to do better. She had come here thinking that if she just admitted she was wrong, if she just told him how much she regretted everything, if she just let herself be vulnerable in a way she never had before, that maybe, just maybe, he would take her back. But now she wasn't so sure. Ethan had changed, had hardened in a way she hadn't expected, had grown into someone who no longer looked at her like she was the most important person in the room. He wasn't hanging on her every word, wasn't waiting for her to give him some kind of validation, wasn't acting like the man who had once bent over backward to keep her happy, and that realization hit her harder than she had prepared for. But she couldn't walk away now. She had already lost too much. So she took a shaky breath, steeling herself, forcing herself to push forward, to say what she had come here to say, to lay it all out and hope that he would see how much she meant it. "I don't care what it takes," she said, her voice softer than before but no less desperate. "I'll do anything, Ethan. I just need you to give me a chance to fix this." Ethan didn't react immediately, didn't rush to reassure her, didn't give her the easy forgiveness that she had once taken for granted. Instead, he let her words hang in the air, let them sit between them like a test, like he was waiting to see if she really meant it. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly, his fingers flexing at his sides, his jaw tightening just enough for her to know that whatever he was about to say was going to hurt. "You keep saying you'll do anything," he said, his voice calm, steady, too steady, like he had already made up his mind. "But what does that even mean, Rachel? What exactly are you willing to do?" Rachel felt her stomach tighten, her hands clenching at her sides, because she hadn't actually thought that far ahead, hadn't really considered what anything meant beyond the fact that she was willing to swallow her pride and admit she had screwed up. But Ethan wasn't interested in just hearing her regret. He wanted to know if she actually understood what she had done. "I don't know," she admitted, exhaling sharply, hating how small her voice sounded, how exposed she felt standing there in front of him, waiting for him to decide if she was still worth fighting for. "I just know that I miss you, that I miss us, that—" She hesitated, licking her lips, shaking her head slightly, desperate to find the right words, the ones that would bring him back to her. "I know I was selfish, Ethan. I know I let go of something real for the dumbest reasons, and I hate myself for it." Ethan let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head, rubbing a hand over his face, as if he were trying to keep himself from saying something he would regret. "Yeah, Rachel, you were selfish," he said, his voice sharper now, no longer guarded, no longer holding back. "You didn't just let me go. You threw me away like I was some placeholder in your life, like I was something temporary, like I was never going to be enough." Rachel flinched at the words, because even though she had already admitted it to herself, even though she had spent weeks torturing herself with the reality of what she had done, hearing him say it out loud made it feel so much worse. "I was stupid," she whispered, barely able to look at him now, barely able to hold his gaze, barely able to breathe through the ache settling into her chest. "I thought—" She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head, her throat tightening with the weight of everything she should have realized sooner. "I thought I needed more. I thought I could do better. And I was wrong." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his posture still rigid, still unforgiving, still unwilling to let her off the hook. "You hurt me," he said finally, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "You made me feel like I wasn't good enough, like I was just some guy holding you back from the life you really wanted. And now that you realize you were wrong, you just expect me to forget all of that." Rachel felt her stomach drop, her breath catching in her throat, because she could hear it in his voice, could hear the exhaustion, the hesitation, the unwillingness to go through that pain again. "I don't expect you to forget," she said quickly, desperately, taking a small step closer, trying to reach for him before stopping herself, before realizing that he wasn't ready for that. She swallowed hard, shaking her head, hating how exposed she felt, how terrified she was that she had already lost him for good. "I just want a chance to prove that I'm not that person anymore." Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving hers, his body still tense, still holding something back, still weighing something in his mind that she couldn't quite decipher. And then, after another agonizing beat of silence, he finally spoke. "You want a chance to prove it?" he asked, his voice even, careful, measured. Rachel nodded quickly, clinging to the small sliver of hope that his words gave her. "Yes, more than anything." Ethan studied her for another long moment, then sighed, shaking his head, his expression still unreadable, still guarded. "All right," he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "Then let's see if you mean it." Rachel's breath hitched, her heart pounding, because she knew that whatever happened next was going to determine everything. Because this wasn't just about winning him back. This was about proving that she had ever deserved him in the first place. Ethan stood there, his hands in his pockets, his gaze locked on Rachel, taking her in, really looking at her in a way he never had before, in a way that wasn't clouded by love, by nostalgia, by the desperate need to be enough for her. He had spent so much time chasing her, proving himself to her, making himself small so she could feel bigger, making himself quiet so she could take up all the space, making himself the kind of man she would never feel embarrassed to be with. But now, as she stood in front of him, eyes pleading, voice soft, posture uncertain, he finally saw it. The woman who had let him go so easily was now the one who couldn't bear to be without him. And yet, even now, even with her standing there, saying all the things he had once prayed to hear, something inside him had shifted, something inside him had hardened, something inside him had stopped waiting for her to decide whether or not he was worthy. Rachel looked up at him, her hands shaking slightly, her breath uneven, her lips parted like she was waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to put her out of her misery, waiting for him to give her the answer she so desperately needed. And for the first time, Ethan realized that he had the power here, that for once she was the one standing in uncertainty. She was the one afraid of what he was going to say next. She was the one who was now at the mercy of his decision. For so long, he had let himself believe that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, that losing her was his greatest failure, that if only he had been better, if only he had been more, she never would have let him go. But now he wasn't so sure, because the more he looked at her, the more he realized that maybe she had never deserved him at all. Rachel let out a shaky breath, taking a small step closer, hesitating for a moment before reaching out, before trying to touch him, trying to close the distance that she had put between them when she walked away. But Ethan didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't meet her halfway, didn't give her the reassurance she was looking for. And when she saw that, when she realized that the dynamic between them had shifted, something in her expression flickered. Something like fear, something like understanding, something like regret that had come too late. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to grab onto him, as if she wanted to hold on to something solid, something real, something that had already started slipping through her fingers. "Please, just tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what I need to do to fix this." Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze still steady, still unreadable, still carrying the weight of every moment she had made him feel like he wasn't enough, every moment she had taken his love for granted, every moment she had treated him like something temporary. "You don't get it, do you?" he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, his words slow and deliberate, making sure she heard them, making sure she felt them. "It's not about what you can do. It's not about proving anything. It's about the fact that you made your choice, Rachel." Rachel flinched slightly, her teeth sinking into her bottom lip, her body going rigid because she knew what was coming. She could feel it, could sense it, could see the moment slipping away from her. "I was wrong," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice more desperate now, her breath coming faster. "I didn't know. I didn't realize how much I needed you until..." She let out a frustrated exhale, trying to gather the words, trying to make him understand, trying to make him stay. "Until I saw what my life was without you." Ethan let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head, looking away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. And when he did, his expression was colder, clearer, free of the love that had once blinded him to everything she had taken from him. "That's the problem, Rachel," he murmured, his voice steady, calm, devastatingly final. "You didn't realize what you had until you lost it." Rachel swallowed hard, her throat dry, her body tense, because she could feel the shift, could feel the decision settling into his bones, could feel the moment slipping further and further away from her. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head, and when he spoke again, his words were like the final nail in the coffin, the last thing she ever wanted to hear. "You made your choice 5 hours ago," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle, almost pitying. "You don't get to take it back just because it hurts now." Rachel's breath hitched, her fingers curling into fists, her vision blurring slightly, because she had never felt this kind of loss before, had never felt this kind of pain, had never truly understood what it meant to regret something so deeply that it physically hurt. She had convinced herself that Ethan would always be there, that he would always be waiting, that he would always love her enough to take her back the moment she changed her mind. But she had waited too long. And now he was walking away. Ethan didn't say anything else, didn't wait for her to argue, didn't wait for her to try to stop him, didn't wait for her to make another desperate plea. He just took a slow step back, then another, and then he turned and walked toward the door, not looking back, not hesitating, not giving her a chance to change his mind. Rachel stood there, frozen in place, her hands still shaking, her breath still uneven, watching as the one thing she had thought she could get back was now slipping away from her forever. The door opened. Ethan stepped outside. The door closed behind him, and Rachel was left standing in the silence, her expression unreadable, her heart pounding, her world suddenly feeling so much smaller than it had before. Because for the first time in her life, she had made a choice that she couldn't undo. And now, she had to live with it,